During the early church, there was an emperor who was particularly bad by the name of Nero. Maybe you've heard of him. He persecuted Christians, crucified them, lit their bodies on fire for garden parties. And this is the guy that was in charge of everything. He said, pay me taxes. And you know what St. Paul said about that? He said, yeah, pay your taxes. That's kind of a weird thing for us to think about. And what does that mean for us today? Hey folks, I'm Pastor Eric Tritten from Gloria Lutheran Church in Hudson, Ohio, and this is a weekly word. I'm glad you're with me today because, boy, today is one of those days here in the United States. You know, the people talk about the Ides of March, but the Ides of April are really important around here because on the 15th of April, it's tax day in the United States. Americans often have kind of a complicated relationship with taxes and how we feel about taxes in the government. I mean, there was a statement, a creed almost, at the beginning of our country saying no taxation without representation. And this was a big sparking point in the American Revolution when the tax rate was 1 to 1.5%. Here in the, well, we weren't the United States yet. And here's another piece of irony. If you were back in Britain, it was a little bit higher back there. So it's not like they were even being taxed at the normal British citizen level. Today, the tax rate runs between 10 and 37%. Income taxes have been used in various ways in the United States. There was a period of time where they were temporarily brought into effect during the Civil War. But they finally really came into full effect in 1913 with the 16th Amendment that ratified an income tax as something that is legal. And even at that point, the rate was 1% to 7% compared to 10 to 37 today. And as we come up on the 250th anniversary of the country, it's kind of a strange thought that pretty much the first 137 years that this country existed, there were no income taxes. Now, that's not to say there weren't taxes. There were plenty of other taxes that were, out there. In fact, there's a famous event that took place called the Whiskey Rebellion, and a lot of that had to do with taxes being placed on the whiskey that was being made in certain parts of the country. So here in Ohio, there's a push going on right now to get rid of property taxes. So when we think about our relationship with taxes, boy, there's a lot of resistance to paying taxes. And some of that makes sense. We work hard for our money and you don't want to give it away. But the purpose of the government is, to make sure that we have protection in this world, that there is justice that is maintained, and a certain amount of care for people, looking out for the least of these type of a thing. And that requires funding. And, well, where does that come from? It comes from our taxes. And the Bible is a little scant on exactly what the responsibilities of the government are, in terms of, do you have to do A, B, and C or in a particular way? No, it doesn't flat out say that. So as long as the government is running in kind of a just way, it is good and right for us to pay our taxes, to support things like our military and police. But how much do you give to those things? How much of that government budget belongs there that your taxes support? What about health care? Should we have universal health care? Should the government help with health care? There's good arguments on kind of both sides of that. And to what degree do your taxes go to support the health care of the country? What about things like abortion and euthanasia? Do we want our government paying for those things and our taxes to go toward them? What about transgender care? Do you want your taxes going to support that? What about those times in the government where we look and we see that there's incredible fraud? Or we look and we see that there's great waste in terms of how our taxes are being spent. So those are things for us to think about and for us to engage in the conversation of our country in. Now, that is one of the blessings that we have here as citizens of the United States when we interact with the government is that we do have representation and we do have a say about what happens with our tax money. We get a certain amount of say through those elected representatives that go to, well, here in Ohio, to our state capital in Columbus, or nationally to Washington, D.C. But what if you don't like your representative's policies? But what if you voted for the other guy or gal that ran and you did not get the person that you wanted in there? Well, in Romans chapter 13, it says that we should pay to those that we owe. If we owe respect, respect. If we owe taxes, taxes. And even Jesus in his life paid taxes. Now, back to that Romans passage for a second. Do you know who was emperor in Rome when Paul wrote this letter? It was a guy named Nero. Nero is not known as one of the great emperors of the Roman Empire. He was known as one who persecuted the church. He was very hard on Christians at certain points. And Paul says, pay your taxes. So when we pay our taxes, there is a recognition of there's good parts of this and there's bad parts of this. God gives us government in order to help us to have good lives. But in a sinful world, the government doesn't always live up to that. And so we speak the truth to that, and we speak from God's word to say we want what is good and true and just. And at the same time, we recognize that we have a duty and a responsibility to pay for our taxes. There's always going to be problems in the system. People who search for utopias, they always find tyranny is where that always ends up. Governments do things that are important to have happen for the peace and the prosperity of the country. And God has established governments in such a way so that we can have a good judicial system, so that people can have justice. Now, I'm not saying that it works perfectly, even here in the United States, but it works pretty well on the whole. Do you like to be able to have a 911 system, so where there's an emergency, you can call? Do you like the idea of other people in your life being able to call if they have an emergency to get somebody there to help them? That requires funding. And that's, our taxes go to pay for EMS in our community. Public education. There's a lot of debate around that, but on the whole, having an educated citizenry is a good thing. And to be able to support that with the taxes of your community, that makes sense. We want to have our property protected. So having a police force, a fire department. You see where I'm going with this? There's so much that the government does so that we can have peace, we can have prosperity, and we can live with a relative comfort within this country. And again, are there problems with our system? Yeah, it's because it's run by sinners. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of good that happens there. When we look at the United States, there are things that we can criticize in terms of protection for the powerful. There's this whole situation with the files regarding Jeffrey Epstein, and apparently there are a lot of people that are named in there who are being protected. At least that information's not coming out. Maybe you're very uncomfortable with that. I know I am. I know that there's cronyism that happens. It always strikes me how many politicians come into government in a relative level of income and they leave rather rich. That's not an accident, I don't think. And it's not usually through good things that have happened in their lives. You can point to the history of the country. You can see where there's been selective enforcement of our laws. One of those areas right now, we can think about what's happening with border enforcement. The border situation isn't something that's new. This has been something that has been an issue in our country for decades and decades and decades. And we've kept kicking the can down the road, and maybe you're happy with how this is being handled now. Maybe you're not. What do you do with that? So what is a Christian to do when it comes to taxes? Well, pay them. Pay them. And if you're not happy with them, definitely talk with your representatives and seek to make those changes. Pray. Pray for your government. This is something that God calls us to do, to pray for kings and governors and people who are in authority. And I don't know that we spend enough time doing that. God has blessed us with these people. Even the people in their imperfection can be a great blessing to us. Pray for them and pray that God's will is done among them and that they will be wise and that they will make decisions that will be good for the citizens of our country, good for our neighbors. This is part of loving our neighbors. Somebody said something about loving your neighbor, right? And give thanks. We do a really good job of complaining about government. I know I'm really good at that. But it is right to give thanks for the government that we have. Here in the United States, we have a lot of blessings. And if you're watching this in another country, I'd be willing to bet that you can look at your government and see a lot of things that you're thankful for there too. Give thanks to God for those things. Take them back to Him and say, hey, yeah, I recognize there are some imperfections here, but boy, oh boy, thank you that at least I have this. So when we deal with government, when we deal with taxes, maybe it's something that leaves us with a mixed taste in our mouth. We are, after all, people who were not meant for this kingdom for eternity. God has called us to live in glory with Him forever. But we're here now. And so we have a relationship with our neighbors that gets tied up with government. And in order to make the world a better place, we participate in that and in various ways. Sometimes it's just by being kind and loving our neighbors. Other times, it's by chipping into the common good. Even if we feel coerced in doing it, it's still helping with the common good of our neighbors. So those are some things to think about. I don't think that this is completely thorough by any stretch of the imagination. So if you've got some thoughts that you would like to share, please feel free to put them in the comments. I do like to read those and see what people are thinking. And if this is helpful, like it, share it, subscribe, all of those wonderful things. And we'll be back with something different next week. God's blessings.